Gemara, it's Motzei Shabbos Mevorchim Shvat, and today's blot is Daf Peches. We'll begin from the Mishnah. Now, this Mishnah, there are quite a few ways of learning Shvat in the Mishnah. We'll learn just one way. So the husband has a right to know the vows of his wife. What happens if he was not, and he only has a window of Yom Shama, the day he heard? What happens if he wasn't aware that he was allowed to? Then, and when he becomes aware, that's when the Yom Shama is for that person. So if 2 weeks later he found out he's allowed to know the daughter of his wife, that's the day, that's the window he has till that evening. So the Mishnah says, Yodei I know sheyesh nedarim. I know that our vows. I will only there did not know sheyesh mefidin, that you have allowed, that a husband is allowed to annul it. Then Yofer. So as if the day that he found out, that's the day that he heard about it, and therefore you have that day. Even though it might be a month after you heard the original vow, you can annul it that day. What about, he says, Yodei I do know sheyesh mefidin, that there are some vows he permitted to annul. I will only I did not know shezen neder. Either I did not know that this constitutes a vow, or I did not know that this particular vow is one of the ones that you permitted to annul. Remember, a husband can annul either if it's inui nefesh, which he harms himself, or where it's beinoi lebina, where that directly affects their relationship. He didn't know that which nedarim you can't. Here Reb Meir says lo yafer, and why not? So we're going to learn, like those who showed me learned. The reason why lo yafer is because he cannot be mefer, because he already knew that you couldn't know certain nedarim. So he had a partial knowledge, and a partial knowledge is considered knowledge. So you already heard about it a month ago. Too late. You can't be mefer. And the Chachamim say yafer. Partial knowledge is not called knowledge, as if you didn't know, and therefore, whenever you found out, that's the day you can go ahead and know. Says Rabbeinu have a problem with that. So what are you telling me? Rameir holds that a partial knowledge is considered a knowledge. So I have a problem with that. With another Rameir, the law is that if you kill somebody inadvertently, what do they call it in America? They call it involuntary. What do you call it? Involuntary. What's the word they use? They're just using that for that fellow there.
Manslaughter.
Manslaughter, that's it. Sorry, yeah. Involuntary manslaughter. So in Jewish law, you go to a gullus, you go to exile. And the pasuk says that if you didn't notice, you didn't see, and it was an accident, and you were chopping a tree, and the handle went flying, and you hurt somebody by mistake and killed them, you have to go to a miklat. Otherwise, the next of kin has a right to kill you or has a mitzvah to kill you. And the question is, what about a blind person? A blind person is someone that can never see, and so what is a blind person also go to Golos? Because the pasuk says he didn't see, or do we read the pasuk below? You didn't see, you could have seen, but you didn't, and therefore it's an accident. But if somebody who can never see is not included, so it says here below Reis prat l'suma. Rabbi Yehuda's opinion that the person is blind, that means he can never see. Below means he didn't notice it now, but this blind person can never see it, so he's not included. And Rab Meir says the rabbis esasum. We have a pasuk to include the blind person, but even though the person can never see, he's included. Now, if it would not have been for that pasuk, what would Rab Meir have said? That a blind person is excused, is not included. Now, a blind person also has a partial knowledge, because a blind person over time develops their hearing. It's far more acute than an average person, and they can hear if there are other people around. So this blind person doesn't have full sight, but he can hear, he can notice if there's anybody around, should be more cautious. So the blind person has partial knowledge. Had it not been for the pasuk below Ra'is, I would have said that a blind person is excused because it's not his fault. Which means even though the blind person had partial knowledge, it's not called knowledge, it's not his fault. But of course, we have a pasuk, so we're going to include him. Now, it's a contradiction. Rameir in our Mishnah says partial knowledge is considered knowledge. You should have annulled the neder from your wife as soon as you heard about it. Even though you didn't really realize, you can annul this neder. Partial knowledge is considered knowledge. And now you're telling me when it comes to our miklat, that partial knowledge is not considered knowledge. And therefore, you're telling me that the blind person had not been for the pasuk, we would have excused him, and even though he knows what's going on, it doesn't matter. So it's a contradiction. So Rava comes along and says, you got it wrong. The argument of Rabbi Yehuda Meir is based on how to understand the context of the psukim. It's more technical than about partial knowledge. It has to do with the fact that how do we read the psukim? Because the story of a person who committed murder I guess inadvertently, is recorded in the Torah a number of times, more than once, more than twice. And each time that adds another layer. So the argument of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir is when the pasuk below ra'os, is it coming to include or coming to exclude? In other words, without the pasuk, what would we have thought? But not logic, but what we have thought, not because partial knowledge, what would we have thought from other sentences. So, comes along Rabbi Amar, top of the page, Hacham in Yonah the Krav, Hacham in Yonah the Krav. Look at the context of the psukim. Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, Gabe Rotzeach, when it talks about, it opens up, it prefaces by its comments by the following. See what it says, if somebody goes into the forest and encounters their friend, it says somebody. Does it say who that somebody is? Doesn't matter. No qualifications. So therefore, it's all inclusive. So if the pasuk then says below rois, you didn't notice. Now the pasuk is trying to limit it, trying to exclude. So it must be coming to exclude. If the pasuk below rois is coming actually to include the blind person, you don't need it. It's superfluous. We already said that anybody who walks into a forest, that would have included a blind person as well. Why would you need below rois that he doesn't see? He doesn't see them. To tell you what, that a blind person is included because he cannot see. No, must be coming to exclude. We would have thought a blind person is included because he walked into the forest. So he said, no, below rois. Somebody didn't notice it now, but they could see everything else. Could have seen it if they wanted to. Says the Gemara. Anybody can walk into the forest. Everybody. The Sumanami Bar Meliyah, a blind person is included. He also walks into the forest. If you can tell me who, you can tell me below rois. The rabbi says, if you can tell me below rois, I'm going to tell you that what a blind person is included, because the fact is he didn't see. I don't care if he can never see or just this moment. Then we already know that from the fact that it says anybody who walks into the forest. So we know a blind person is included. It comes to tell you that below rois is prat l'sumah. Coming to tell you that below rois is an exception for a blind person. In other words, come to exclude a blind person. That's the view of Rabbi Yehuda. Meir holds, see if it says in the pasuk, there's another exclusion of the pasuk. It says, but bli das, he wasn't aware. That means he could have been aware, but he wasn't. So that already excludes the blind person. The blind person, even though he has partial knowledge, doesn't have full knowledge, couldn't really be fully aware. So when it says bli das without being fully aware, we're excluding a blind person. And then it says below ra'is, and if you're going to interpret below ra'is means that that we're excluding a blind person, which means a person who right now cannot see, but he could see generally, and a blind person can never see, so not included. So you have two exclusions for a blind person: somebody who's not fully aware, and somebody not. Why would you need two exclusions to tell you a blind person is exempt? And we have a rule: double negative is a positive. Blind and a blind becomes a positive. Called the bar meida, the maid holds. The bleed das without being aware, called the bar meida. That what he could have been aware. The summa lav bar meidu, and a blind person does not have full knowledge, so therefore he's excluded. You can tell me that below ra'os, that the words when it says in the pasuk he didn't notice, which means he could have noticed, but he didn't. But a blind person is excluded. Prat l'summa mibli das nafkalei. But don't we already know that from the other pasuk where it says he wasn't fully aware? So you need two psukim to exclude. Must be. When we have two exclusions, it must be actually it's coming to include. To include a blind person. So that's the argument. In fact, Rabbi Yehuda holds generally throughout Shas that a blind person is exempt from all mitzvahs. We'll have in Kedushin soon, where Rabbi Yosef, who was blind himself, says, if anybody tells me the halach is like Rabbi Yehuda, that a blind person is potter from mitzvahs, I will make a big party because I'm blind and I'm exempt, and yet I'm doing all the mitzvahs. I'm going to get all this wonderful credit. So Rabbi Yehuda is consistent with his view that a blind person exempt from mitzvahs is also exempt from this whole thing of Arim Miklat. That's what some of the Rishonim want to say. Says the Mishnah, next Mishnah. We had certain similar issues to this before, but here we're going to talk about a concept where we say, whatever, since the husband provides for his wife and everything else, whatever belongs to the wife, Mashakana Isha Kana goes directly to the husband. There's actually a machlekes tanaim, an argument tanaim between the mayor and the chachami, but they don't really argue about the relationship between husband and wife. They talk about a servant and his master. But the idea, once you tell me that the wife's earnings go to the husband, then we say, where else do we find that? From a legal concept. not an emotional concept, legal. And we say, well, we find the same thing by an eved, a servant and a master. So whatever the relationship is there, legally we'll use the same kind of relationship here. And that is that whatever a woman is koine goes straight to the husband. Unless she says, don't provide for me, I'll take care of myself. Now, the problem is, this problem here that we have a case of the father-in-law who hates the son-in-law. So he made a vow, I don't want my son-in-law to have any benefit from me whatsoever. But he sees that his daughter's struggling, she needs financial help. He wants to give her kids, but not to the husband. The problem is whatever he gives her automatically goes to the husband. He's breaching the neder. According to the Ran and Moshe Shainim, the father-in-law then will commit a sin. According to the Rambam, the son-in-law will commit a sin. So how do you get around it? So it says in Mishnah, somebody made a neder, doesn't want to have his son-in-law having any benefit from him. But he wants to give his daughter money. He tells her, I'm gifting this to you, my daughter, but that doesn't help because as soon as you gift it to her, it goes to the husband. But on the proviso, I don't want your husband to have any share. We're in that Pei Chesed Aleph, we're doing the Mishnah on the bottom of the page. And this is the case where the father-in-law doesn't get on with the son-in-law, and he doesn't want his son-in-law to have any benefit from him whatsoever. Doesn't have any benefit whatsoever. So the son-in-law says that the son-in-law says that the father-in-law says, I want to give my daughter, I'm gifting to my daughter on the condition it does not transfer over to her husband, but legally it should. So I'm making it two conditions here. First of all, I don't want it to transfer to her husband, number one. And number two, he adds, only that which you place in your mouth. In other words, you can take the money and buy food, and that's it. It goes to you. So because he added this extra clause that it's food and that it goes to you, so what do you call it? So therefore, that means she doesn't really own it. She could only buy food with it, and she doesn't become really hers until she puts it in her mouth. So, and at that moment, it's too late. The husband can't have anything. So therefore, that's how he overcomes it. But if he says to her, for example, buy only clothes, I'm strictly buying clothes, then it's questionable because maybe the clothes will pass on to the husband. So they have two opinions whether that works or not. But by food, it works. By food, when I say I want you to take this money and buy food with it, it doesn't become she has no right to use the money for her own purpose. She has no ownership. It's only when she puts it in her mouth, it's consumable and it's perishable, then she has ownership. At that stage, the husband can't take it back, obviously. So that's how he gets around it. So Omar Rav says, now the Mishnah clearly spells out that you have to add these two conditions. Says the Gemara, up to the Gemara. Pei Chesed on the bottom. Omar Rav says, Rav, Lo Yishanu, this is not talking about Ela de Amala, only if he adds these two clauses. Masha Atnei Sas, when it says he has the extra layer that only that applies to food, which you place in your mouth. Because I hold, says Rav, that the halacha is like Rameir that says that whatever she has goes to the husband, even if the person makes it conditional that it shouldn't transfer to the husband, doesn't help. It still goes to the husband unless you clearly say you add another contingent, and that is contingency. There has to be another proviso that you can only use it to purchase food. Aval, if he would have said to her, Masha Tirtze Asi, he said, well, if he says to her, whatever you want to do with the money, do with the money, then Kana Yasambal, it does transfer to the husband automatically. Shmuel says, no, I follow the rabbis who say that we don't say that, that if you gave it to her on the condition that the husband should not have it, I feel if even if he says, Masha Tirtze Asi, do with it whatever you want, like Kana Yasambal, the husband is not kained. Now, what's the crux of their argument? Whether you can make it conditional that it shouldn't be transferred to the husband. The crux of the argument is as follows. How do we understand the legal aspect of it? Okay, let's say your wife has it and it gets transferred to the husband. There's two ways of understanding it. One way is all the earnings belong to her, and then afterwards, legally, it gets transferred to the husband. Is that how we understand it? Or as soon as she earns it, it becomes the husband straight away. She has no earnings, becomes the husband straight away. Her hand is the husband's hand. And the difference is as follows. If she has her own ability to acquire, and then legally we transfer it from her to the husband, then you can make a condition. You can build, you can sever that relationship and say to her, or rupture it and say, I want it to go to your hand and stop right there. I don't want to move any further to the husband. That's Shmuel. But Rav says, no. Rav says, that the wife's hand is the husband. So how can you separate the two? You can't. So unless you clearly say, I don't even want it to belong to you, you buy food with it and you place it in your mouth. So she doesn't have anything, there's nothing to give to the husband. And the moment she puts it in her mouth, there's nothing left to give to the husband. Okay, says the Gemara, masculine Rab Zeir asks a question. So we're up to the top of Peiches on the base. They ask, Keman Ozla Hashmaita the Rav. It seems that Rav makes a ruling like Rab Meir. And he holds whatever the woman owns, goes straight to the husband. Ramino have a problem with that. What's the problem? When we know we have a concept of Eruv Chatzeris, a Shetufim Avois. Eruv Chatzeris is you have 2 or 3 houses sharing one courtyard. And the rabbi said, we don't allow you to transfer from your house into the courtyard on Shabbos unless you make an Eruv Chatzeris. And the reason is very simple. Your house belongs to you. The courtyard is shared by a couple of people. So the courtyard relative to your house is like a public space compared to a private space. And if you are going to carry from your house into the courtyard, you're going to think, if I can carry into the courtyard, why can't I carry into the street? If I can carry from my house into a sort of a semi-public or quasi-public domain, why can't I transfer to the street as well? So you have to make an Eruv. The idea of an Eruv is that we go to one of the houses, everyone has shared, put some food there, so therefore, like this, we have one common house, and we're all living in the same place. Then you have a side street known as a mavli. You have a number of chatzeros, courtyards that spill into this mavli, and the same thing. Even though courtyard is a semi-public or quasi-public place, you have 2 or 3 houses, but a mavli, a street, will have 10 courtyards. It's even more public. So if we allow you to carry into the mavli, you think, why can't I already carry into the main street? So you have to make another, it's called a shitufim avoid. You take a barrel of wine and you put it in one of the houses, if we all share together, we all together. Now, either everyone contributes towards it, or another way of doing it is where one person has a barrel, has a barrel of wine, gives it to somebody else and says, I want you to lift it, acquire it on behalf of everybody. And because it's a positive thing, even though they're not aware of it, it's as if they all acquired it. So you have to give it to someone that it has to leave the possession of the donor and go into someone else's possession who lifts it and has everyone in mind. So Rab Meir is generally the author of all the Mishnayos. In this Mishnah, it says, Ravina asks a question. It says, how do you join in together when it comes to a street? Maniach, it's a chavaz, you place down the barrel. Well, you say, I'm having this, I'm getting you to acquire this on behalf of everyone living in the street. Who can you give it to a stranger? Or if you give it to your Jewish servants because they're totally independent from you. So when they lift it, they're lifting it on behalf of everyone. When your older children who therefore have nothing to do with you either, they're independent from you. And it's clearly through your wife. That means when you give it to her, it's as if the barrel left your possession. And because it left your possession, therefore it's you can acquire for everybody else. Now the question is, you just said, or Meir holds, that whatever a woman acquires automatically goes to the husband. So when you gave the barrel to your wife to acquire for everybody else, it doesn't work because it never left your possession. Whatever she picks up, it's as if it's in your hand still. So how does it work? They ask the question, if you're going to tell me that Kana Yasad Baila, if you're going to tell me that even though a mayor talks about a servant, you wanted to compare a woman's relation to the husband to a servant legally from the legal standpoint, then then it never left the possession of the husband. So how's it going to work? So Rava comes along with a brilliant idea, and he said there's a difference if someone else is giving it to the wife or if the husband himself. When someone else gives it to the wife, you can't make conditions, automatically goes to the husband. But if the husband himself is giving it to her, and he says, I want you to pick up this barrel, and be like everybody else, then it does work. Then it does work. So the husband can give gifts to his wife, and when he does, it belongs entirely to her. Now, Amar Rava, even though generally we say whatever she earns goes to the husband. He concedes when it comes to shituv, the kivan the lischas la'achedimu miyad ba'il zachir. But over here, since the husband is giving it to her, it works. Now, because the husband is the one who's giving her the barrel, so therefore it works. Says the Gemara, I got a problem with that, and the problem in logic also, we'll see technical. The problem logically is he's not giving it to her so that she can keep it. He's giving it to her to acquire for everybody else. So it's not, when we say that a husband can give a gift to his wife and belong entirely to her, he wants her to have it. Okay, so it cuts off all his ties. But over here, he's giving it to her only so that she can acquire for everybody else. He doesn't really want her to have it. So it goes back to the legal standpoint. Whatever she earns goes back to the husband. So how does it work? But that's good. And now technically, Ravina said, Ravashi, I don't understand Rabba. He wants to say that the husband gave it to her. No problem. So let me ask you, how are you going to explain this price? It says, the following you can give to your older children, even when you're Jewish servants. The following, but the following people you cannot give it to. It says the young children, the or your non-Jewish servants, they're not independent, and the Ishtai clearly says you cannot give it to your wife because it never left your possession. In fact, we have a contradiction between the Mishnah and the Brisa. Rashi said, I'll tell you, when you give it to her in order to acquire for everybody else, according to Rabbi, it doesn't work because you don't really want her to have it. So therefore, whatever she picks up automatically goes to the husband. We're talking about a case here that the law is if you have, let's say, 5 houses that share one courtyard, and 4 of the houses are happy to share in and chip in and share a common kitchen. But ones are not interested. I don't want to. Doesn't want to join. Nobody can carry. That person broke the Erev because you need everyone to join in. We're talking about a case here where his wife actually owns a house in that courtyard or in that street. She owns it outright because she inherited while they were engaged, and they made up that he has no share in it. Okay, so it's completely hers. Now, if it's completely hers, she also has to receive some of that wine, right? So that she can say that I'm part of this whole thing. So he has to give her that she should actually keep some of the wine, not just as a middle person. She's one of the end users, one of the end receivers, because she has a house and she has to be part of this whole thing. And the moment that she receives it for her own self, she can also acquire for everybody else. So when we say, I want you to acquire for everybody else, but she doesn't own a house, so I don't really want her to keep it, then you cannot use your wife because it never leaves your possession. But when the Mishnah says you could use your wife, it's talking about a case where she owns her own house. So when you gave the wine to her, you want her to keep part of that wine, to actually keep it, so that she can be part of it. And therefore, she can also then acquire it on behalf of everybody else. Says the Gemara. There's a courtyard, and that street. Since she herself has to acquire part of it, she acquires for everybody else as well. Okay. It's the pasuk. A widow or a divorcee makes a vow, yakum Allah, she has to abide by it. That's obviously something's not right. Why shouldn't she have to abide by it? She's a single woman and she makes a neder like anybody else. She has to abide by her vows. So what's the pasuk trying to tell us? So Kate said, the Mishnah will tell us an interesting thing. What happens? She made a neder when she was married, that something will take effect in the future. By the time the neder has to take effect, they're no longer married. And the husband annulled it while they were married. But when the neder should come into effect, they're no longer married. Does that annulment still exist? Well, all the way around. She made a neder before she got married, and she said at a certain time, I want to start something. And then she got married before that time. And the husband now wants to annul the neder. Can he? In other words, do we focus on the time the neder was made or the time the neder comes into force, comes into effect? And that's what the pasuk comes to teach you. Kate said, she said, I'll be a Nazir in 30 days. So when she made the neder, she was a widow. She was alone. But then when she got married, so by the time the neder comes into effect, he's a married woman. Says the pasuk, says the pasuk, if she made the neder while she was an almana, she has to abide by it, and the husband cannot annul it, even though the neder doesn't take effect till after they got married. What about Nodra? She made a vow. The Hebrew vow while she was married. And she made for the husband, even though when the neder came into effect, no longer. For example, she said, I'll be in between. And meanwhile, the husband annulled it, and the husband died. divorced. Alpha patient is alman is gasher, widow or divorced. Between 30 days, harez the muffer. It's annulled. Why? Because the Mishnah give me two examples where the main thing is not so much when the neder comes to effect. The main thing is when she actually made the neder. That's all that matters. When did she make the neder? Case number 3. What about Nodra Boy Biyon? She got married Monday morning, and she made a vow while they were married. And then in his garsha, that was 10 o'clock in the morning. 12 o'clock, they got divorced. Boy Biyon on that day. And then and then 2 o'clock, they got married a second time. And the question is, a husband cannot annul vows that took place in the past. How do we view the second marriage to the same wife? This is the first marriage, again. Therefore, he has a right to annul the vows that she made in the morning. They were married when she made those the first vows. They were married then, and now they're married again. So maybe he can annul. We say, no, that's passé. Now you're married again. Compared to now, it says another. So another baby, she made it in the morning. What's that day? Very busy day. Einu yochel lahafer. He cannot annul it. He cannot annul it. Why not? There's two understandings. Either they got remarried, so now they're married a second time. And the law is that a husband cannot annul any vows that she made prior to marriage. So separated marriage, and the second marriage is not the first. Any vow that took place, even though it's on the same date, you were married at the time, but this is a new marriage, and that's treated like an earlier vow. It doesn't work. That's one way of understanding. Or they're merely engaged now. But a husband who's engaged cannot annul a vow on his own unilaterally. He needs the support of the father. But because she was married in the morning and got divorced, the father lost his right to annul any of the vows. Therefore, this is the rule. If she left, if she's now in her own control, for example, she was divorced, she's merely engaged, or even though she's got remarried right now, but she's no longer in the control of the original husband, you can no longer annul the vow.